All right, Robinson Crusoe, chapter 5. This is a long chapter. By the end of this chapter, we will be a quarter of the way through the book, our abridged version. A reminder that this is Robinson providing us with his journal. And I believe that this chapter, as we have it in our version, covers his full first year on the island again. So we've been through the first year on the island, and we are going to see it again from another perspective. And due to the length of our text here today, I have some liquid to help my dry lips, so there will be a few interruptions. All right. September 30th, 1659. I, poor miserable Robinson Crusoe, being shipwrecked during a dreadful storm, came on shore on this dismal, unfortunate island, which I called the Island of Despair. All the rest of the ship's company being drowned, and myself almost dead. All the rest of that day I spent in afflicting myself at the dismal circumstances I was brought to. I had neither food, house, clothes, weapon, or place to fly to, and in despair of any relief, saw nothing but death before me, either that I should be devoured by wild beasts, murdered by savages, or starved to death for want of food. At the approach of night, I slept in a tree for fear of wild creatures, but slept soundly, though it rained all night. October 1st. In the morning, I saw, to my great surprise, the ship had floated with the high tide, and was driven on shore again much nearer the island, which as it was some comfort on the one hand, for seeing her sit upright and not broken to pieces, I hoped, if the wind abated, I might get on board and get some food and necessaries out of her for my relief. So, on the other hand, it renewed my grief at the loss of my comrades, who, I imagined, if we had all stayed on board, might have saved the ship, or at least that they would not have been all drowned as they were, and that had the men been saved, we might perhaps have built us a boat out of the ruins of the ship, to have carried us to some other part of the world. I spent a great part of this day in perplexing myself on these things, but at length, seeing the ship almost dry, I went upon the sand as near as I could, and then swam on board this day. This day also it continued raining, though with no wind at all. From the 1st of October to the 24th, all these days entirely spent in many several voyages to get all I could out of the ship, which I brought on shore, every tide of flood upon rafts. Much rain also in these days, though with some intervals of fair weather, but it seems this is the rainy season. October 25th. It rained all night and all day, with some gusts of wind, during which time the ship broke in pieces, the wind blowing a little harder than before, and was no more to be seen except the wreck of her, and that only at low water. I spent this day in covering and securing the goods which I had saved, that the rain might not spoil them. October 26th. I walked about the shore almost all day to find out a place to fix my habitation, greatly concerned to secure myself from an attack in the night, either from wild beasts or men. Towards night I fixed upon a proper place under a rock, and marked out a semicircle for my encampment, which I resolved to strengthen with a work, wall, or fortification made of double stakes, lined within with cables, and without with turf. From the 26th to the 30th I worked very hard in carrying all my goods to my new habitation, though some part of the time it rained exceeding hard. The 31st in the morning I went out into the island with my gun to look for some food, and discovered the country, when I killed a she-goat, and her kid followed me home, which I afterwards killed also, because it would not feed. So he killed a female goat, and the female goat's baby, followed him home. But he couldn't, and in the full book, we see more of this, of him trying to get it to eat, but it won't, and so he ends up having to kill it as well. November 1st. I set up my tent under a rock and lay there for the first night, making it as large as I could with stakes driven in to swing my hammock upon. November 2nd. I set up all my chests and boards and the pieces of timber which made my rafts, and with them formed a fence round me, a little within the place I had marked out for my fortification. November the 3rd. I went out with my gun and killed 2 fowls like ducks, which were very good food. In the afternoon, went to work to make me a table. November 4th. This morning I began to order my times of work, of going out with my gun, time of sleep, and time of diversion. Every morning I walked out with my gun for 2 or 3 hours if it did not rain, then employed myself to work till about 11 o'clock, then eat what I had to live on, and from 12 to 2 I lay down to sleep, the weather being excessive hot, and then in the evening to work again. The working part of this day and of the next were wholly employed in making my table, for I was yet but a very sorry workman, though time and necessity made me a complete natural mechanic soon after, as I believe it would do anyone else. November the 6th. After my morning walk, I went to work with my table again, and finished it, though not to my liking, nor was it long before I learned to mend it. November 7th. Now it began to be settled fair weather. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and part of the 12th, for the 11th was Sunday, I took wholly up to make me a chair, and with much ado brought it to a tolerable shape, but never to please me, and even in the making I pulled it in pieces several times. Note, I soon neglected my keeping Sundays, for omitting my mark for them on my post, I forgot which was which. Remember, he's keeping himself a calendar, and he wants to remember the Sunday so he can keep it as a day of rest, but he loses track. November 13th. This day it rained, which refreshed me exceedingly and cooled the earth, but it was accompanied with terrible thunder and lightning, which frightened me dreadfully for fear of my powder. As soon as it was over, so he doesn't want his gunpowder to become wet and therefore to become ruined and therefore to become useless. As soon as it was over, the rain was over, I resolved to separate my stock of powder into as many little parcels as possible, that it might not be in danger. November 14th, 15th, and 16th. These 3 days I spent in making little square chests or boxes, which might hold a pound or 2 pounds at most of powder, and so putting the powder in, I stowed it in places as secure and remote from one another as possible. On one of these 3 days I killed a large bird that was good to eat, but I know not what to call it. November 17th. This day I began to dig behind my tent into the rock to make room for my farther convenience. Note, 3 things I wanted exceedingly for this work: a pickaxe, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow or basket. So three things. So I desisted from my work and began to consider how to supply that want and make me some tools. As for a pickaxe, I made use of the iron crows, which were proper enough, though heavy. But the next thing was a shovel or spade. This was so absolutely necessary that indeed I could do nothing effectually without it, but what kind of one to make I knew not. So here we're getting a little bit more detail about how he was able to construct his dwelling and all the things that he makes for himself, and all the work that has to go into, first of all, sometimes making the tools before he can make what he wants to make out of them. So if you look at this from an economic point of view, he has to first of all make the capital and to produce the goods that he needs. One man economy. November 18th. The next day in searching the woods, I found a tree of that wood or like it, which in the Brazils they call the iron tree, for its exceeding hardness. Of this, with great labor and almost spoiling my axe, I cut a piece and brought it home too with difficulty enough, for it was exceeding heavy. The excessive hardness of the wood, and having no other way, made me a long while upon this machine, for I worked it effectually by little and little into the form of a shovel or spade, the handle exactly shaped like ours in England, only that the broad part having no iron shod upon it at bottom, it would not last me so long. However, it served well enough for the uses which I had occasion to put it to, but never was a shovel, I believe, made after that fashion, or so long in the making. So he's made himself an entirely wooden shovel, one without an iron or metal end. I was still deficient, for I wanted a basket or wheelbarrow. A basket I could not make by any means, having no such things as twigs that would bend to make wicker ware. At least none yet found out. And as to a wheelbarrow, I fancied I could make all but the wheel, but that I had no notion of, neither did I know how to go about it. So I gave it over, and so for carrying away the earth which I dug out of the cave, I made me a thing like a hod, which the laborers carry mortar in when they serve the bricklayers. This was not so difficult to me as the making of the shovel, and yet this and the shovel and the attempt which I made in vain to make a wheelbarrow took me up no less than 4 days. I mean, always excepting my morning walk with my gun, which I seldom failed, and very seldom failed also bringing home something fit to eat. November 23rd. My other work having now stood still because of my making these tools, when they were finished I went on, and working every day as my strength and time allowed, I spent 18 days entirely in widening and deepening my cave, that it might hold my goods commodiously. Note: during all this time I worked to make this room or cave spacious enough to accommodate me as a warehouse, a kitchen, a dining room, and a cellar. As for my lodgings, I kept to the tent, except that sometimes in the wet season of the year it rained so hard that I could not keep myself dry, which caused me afterwards to cover all my place within my pale with long poles in the form of rafters leaning against the rock, and load them with grass and large leaves of trees like a thatch. December 10th. I began now to think my cave or vault finished, when on a sudden, it seems I had made it too large, a great quantity of earth fell down from the top and one side, so much that in short it frightened me, and not without reason too, for if I had been under it, I had never wanted a grave digger. Essentially, if he'd been in the place where the cave caved in, where the earth fell in, he wouldn't have wanted a grave digger because he would have effectually been buried. Upon this disaster I had a great deal of work to do over again, for I had the loose earth to carry out, and which was of more importance, I had the ceiling to prop up, so that I might be sure no more would come down. December 11th. This day I went to work with it accordingly, and got 2 shores or posts pitched upright to the top, with 2 pieces of boards across over each post. This I finished the next day, and setting more posts up with boards, in about a week more I had the roof secured, and the posts, standing in rows, served me for partitions to part of my house. December 17th. From this day to the 20th I placed shelves and knocked up nails on the posts to hang everything up that could be hung up, and now I began to be in some order within doors. December 20th. Now I carried everything into the cave and began to furnish my house and set up some pieces of boards, like a dresser, to order my victuals upon. But boards began to be very scarce with me. Also, I made me another table. So when they're talking about some pieces of boards like a dresser, they're not talking about a dresser like something that we keep clothes in. They're talking about kind of like a kitchen counter or a kitchen bench. And they call it like a dresser because that's where they would dress the food. Which was an old-fashioned way of saying preparing the food. So you would say you would dress the chicken, which means you would season it and you would stuff it and get it ready to be cooked. So that's what they mean. He's basically getting his kitchen set up. December 27th. Killed a young goat and lamed another so that I caught it and led it home on a string. When I had it home, I bound and splintered up its leg, which was broke. Nota bene. I took such care of it that it lived, and the leg grew well and as strong as ever, but by my nursing it so long it grew tame and fed upon the little green at my door and would not go away. This was the first time that I entertained a thought of breeding up some tame creatures, that I might have food when my powder and shot was all spent. So he essentially now has this tame goat. December 28th, 29th, and 30th. Great heats and no breeze, and so that there was no stirring abroad, except in the evening for food. This time I spent in putting all my things in order within my doors. January 3rd. I began my fence or wall, which being still jealous of my being attacked by somebody, I resolved to make very thick and strong. Nota bene. This wall being described before, I purposely omit what was said in the journal. It is sufficient to observe that I was no less time than from the 3rd of January to the 14th of April, working, finishing, and perfecting this wall, though it was no more than about 24 yards in length, being a half circle from one place in the rock to another place about 8 yards from it, the door of the cave being in the center behind it. When this wall was finished and the outside double fenced with a turf wall raised up close to it, I persuaded myself that if any people were to come on shore there, they would not perceive anything like a habitation, and it was very well I did so, as may be observed hereafter upon a very remarkable occasion. And now, in the managing my household affairs, I found myself wanting in many things, which I thought at first it was impossible for me to make, as indeed as to some of them it was. For instance, I could never make a cask to be hooped. So that's like a barrel with like iron bands hooped around it. In the next place, I was at a great loss for candle, so that as soon as ever it was dark, which was generally by 7 o'clock, I was obliged to go to bed. I remembered the lump of beeswax with which I made candles in my African adventure, but I had none of that now. The only remedy I had was that when I had killed a goat, I saved the tallow, and with a little dish made of clay, which I baked in the sun, to which I added a wick of some oakum, I made me a lamp, and this gave me light, though not a clear, steady light like a candle. In the middle of all my labors, it happened that, rummaging my things, I found a little bag, which had been filled with corn for the feeding of poultry, not for this voyage, but before, as I suppose, when the ship came from Lisbon. What little remainder of corn had been in the bag was all devoured by rats, and I saw nothing in the bag but husks and dust. And being willing to have the bag for some other use, I think it was to put powder in, when I divided it for fear of the lightning or some such use, I shook the husks of the corn out of it on one side of my fortification under the rock. Okay, so going back to previously when he took his gunpowder and he divided it up into little bits, he wasn't just worried about it getting wet, but he was also worried about lightning striking it and then... Yeah. It was a little before the great rains, just now mentioned, that I threw the stuff away, the husks and stuff from the baggie, taking no notice of anything, and not so much as remembering that I had thrown anything there, when about a month after, or thereabout, I saw some few stalks of something green shooting out of the ground, which I fancied might be some plant I had not seen. But I was surprised and perfectly astonished when, after a little longer time, I saw about 10 or 12 ears come out, which were perfectly green barley. It is impossible to express the astonishment and confusion of my thoughts on this occasion, when I saw barley grow there, in a climate which I know was not proper for corn. So he's using corn and barley interchangeably, but he means barley. And especially that I knew not how it came there. It startled me strangely, and I began to suggest that God had miraculously caused this grain to grow without any help of seed sown, and that it was so directed purely for my sustenance on that wild, miserable place. This kind of echoes a little bit, I passage from Scripture, specifically John chapter 12, verse 24. Good News Translation, because that's what I have handy. I am telling you the truth. This is Jesus speaking. A grain of wheat remains no more than a single grain unless it is dropped into the ground and dies. If it does die, then it produces many grains. If you go into verse 25, those who love their own life will lose it. Those who hate their own life in this world will keep it for eternal life. So when Jesus is talking about grains of wheat, he is using it metaphorically. But Robinson's words kind of echo that passage of Scripture. It's more obvious in the original text. Slightly more obvious. This touched my heart a little and brought tears out of my eyes, and I began to bless myself that such a prodigy of nature should happen upon my account. And this was the more strange to me because I saw near it, by the side of the rock, some other straggling stalks, which proved to be stalks of rice, and which I knew because I had seen it grow in Africa when I was ashore there. I not only thought these the pure productions of providence, by providence he means God, by providence for my support, but not doubting but that there was more in the place, I went all over that part of the island where I had been before, peering in every corner and under every rock to look for more of it, but I could not find any. At last it occurred to my thoughts that I had shook a bag of chicken's food out in that place, and then the wonder began to cease, and I must confess my religious thankfulness to God's providence began to abate too, upon the discovering that all this was nothing but what was common, though I ought to have been thankful for such a strange and unforeseen providence, as if it had been miraculous, for it was really the work of providence that 10 or 12 grains of corn should remain unspoiled, when the rats destroyed all the rest, as if it had been dropped from heaven, and that I should throw it out in that particular place, where, it being in the shade of a high rock, it sprang up immediately, whereas if I had thrown it anywhere else at that time, it had been burnt up and destroyed by the heat of the sun. Okay, so first of all, Robinson is amazed. He's like, this is a miracle. There's grains here that I didn't think were possible. And he's like, oh yeah, I just shook it out of that bag. Not a miracle. But really, it was a remarkable coincidence, I guess you could say, that this grain was not destroyed and that it fell in the right spot so that it was able to grow. And in that sense, it still was a miraculous act of God in some ways. And I'm going to read to you a bit of the original text so you can see how it differs from that. And I have it here on my phone. My apologies. I have an ebook version, essentially, of the original text. It is impossible to express the astonishment and confusion of my thoughts on this occasion. And in our copy of the book, this is on page 64. The last paragraph. It is impossible to express the astonishment and confusion of my thoughts on this occasion. I had hitherto acted upon no religious foundation at all, and indeed I had very few notions of religion in my head, or had entertained any sense of anything that had befallen me, otherwise than as a chance, or as we lightly say, what pleases God, without so much as inquiring into the end of providence in these things, or his order in governing events in the world. But after I saw barley grow there in a climate which I know was not proper for corn, and especially that I knew not how it came there, it startled me strangely, and I began to suggest that God had miraculously caused this grain to grow without any help of seed sown, and that it was so directed purely for my sustenance on that wild and miserable place. I am telling you the truth. The grain of wheat remains no more than a single grain unless it is dropped into the ground and dies. And if it does die, then it produces many grains. And he's saying that initially he thought that it was grown without any grains falling. But Jesus himself says that a grain must initially die before it can produce life. Going on to page 66 in our text. I carefully saved the ears of this corn, you may be sure, in their season, which was about the end of June, and laying up every corn, I resolved to sow them all again, hoping in time to have some quantity sufficient to supply me with bread. But it was not till the 4th year that I could allow myself the least grain of this corn to eat, and even then, but sparingly. So up until that time, he has to save all of the corn to plant for the next year's produce because it's such a small quantity. And even then, but sparingly, for I lost all that I sowed the first... Oh, and he explains it a bit more now. For I lost all that I sowed the first season by not observing the proper time, for I sowed it just before the dry season, so that it never came up at all, at least not as it would have done. Besides this barley, there were 20 or 30 stalks of rice, which I preserved with the same care, and whose use was of the same kind, or to the same purpose, to make me bread, or rather, food. For I found ways to cook it up without baking, though I did that also after some time. But to return to my journal. I worked excessive hard these 3 or 4 months to get my wall done, and the 14th of April I closed it up, contriving to go into it not by a door, but over the wall by a ladder, that there might be no sign in the outside of my habitation. April the 16th. I finished the ladder, so I went up with the ladder to the top and then pulled it up after me and let it down in the inside. This was a complete enclosure to me, for within I had room enough and nothing could come at me from without, unless it could first mount my wall. May 1st. In the morning, looking towards the seaside, the tide being low, I saw something on the shore bigger than ordinary, and it looked like a cask. Remember, he said he wasn't able to make a cask. When I came to it, I found a small barrel and 2 or 3 pieces of the wreck of the ship. I examined the barrel and soon found it was a barrel of gunpowder, but it had taken water and the powder was caked as hard as stone. However, I rolled it farther on shore for the present. June the 16th. So a month and a half after our last excerpt. Going down to the seaside, I found a large tortoise or turtle. This was the first I had seen, which it seems was only my misfortune, not any defect of the place or scarcity, for had I happened to be on the other side of the island, I might have had hundreds of them every day, as I found afterwards, but perhaps had paid dear enough for them. June 17th. I spent in cooking the turtle. I found in her 80 eggs, and her flesh was to me at that time the most savory and pleasant that ever I tasted in my life, having had no flesh but of goats and fowls since I landed in this horrid place. June 18th. Rained all day, and stayed within. I thought at this time the rain felt cold, and I was something chilly, which I knew was not usual in that latitude. June 19th. Very ill and shivering, as if the weather had been cold. So he's obviously sick with a fever. June 20th. No rest all night. Violent pains in my head and feverish. June 21st. Very ill. Frightened almost to death. With the apprehension of my sad condition, to be sick and no help. Prayed to God for the first time since the storm off of hell. Long time ago, if you recall, that's when he was just very young and on his first voyage. So you really, though he's been observing Sundays as like a day of rest, so to speak, at least initially, he really has not, and though he was briefly thankful to God for the grains he found, he really hasn't had any kind of relationship with God whatsoever. Prayed to God for the first time since the storm off of hell, but scarce knew what I said or why, my thoughts being all confused. June 22nd. A little better, but under dreadful apprehension of sickness. June 23rd. Very bad again. cold shivering, and then a violent headache. June 24th, much better. June 25th, an ague very violent. That means a fever. The fit held me 7 hours, cold fit and hot, with faint sweats after it. June 26th, better, and having no victuals to eat, took my gun, but found myself very weak. However, I killed a she-goat, and with much difficulty got it home and broiled some of it and ate. I would have fain have stewed it and made some broth, but had no pot. June 27th. The ague again so violent that I lay abed all day and neither ate or drank. So here, me being, well, it's very easy to look back on old texts and just kind of try to hypothesize what illness may be occurring. This sounds to me a little bit like malaria, the fever coming and then going in that way and lasting this long. June 27th, the ague again so violent that I lay abed all day and neither ate or drank. I was ready to perish for thirst, but so weak. I had no strength to stand up or to get myself any water to drink. Prayed to God again, but was light-headed, and when I was not, I was so ignorant that I knew not what to say. Only I lay and cried, Lord, look upon me. Lord, pity me. Lord, have mercy upon me. I suppose I did nothing else for 2 or 3 hours. Till the fit wearing off, I fell asleep. I did not wake till far in the night. When I waked, I found myself much refreshed, but weak and exceeding thirsty. However, as I had no water in my whole habitation, I was forced to lie till morning, and went to sleep again. In this second sleep, I had this terrible dream. I thought I was sitting on the ground of the outside of my wall, and that I saw a man descend from a great black cloud in a bright flame of fire and light upon the ground. He was all over as bright as a flame, so that I could just bear to look towards him. His countenance was almost dreadful, impossible for words to describe. When he stepped upon the ground with his feet, I thought the earth trembled, and all the air looked, to my apprehension, as if it had been filled with flashes of fire. He was no sooner landed upon the earth, but he moved forward towards me with a long spear or weapon in his hand to kill me. And when he came to a rising ground at some distance, he spoke to me, or I heard a voice so terrible that it is impossible to express the terror of it. All that I can say I understood was this: seeing all these things have not brought thee to repentance, now thou shalt die. At which words I thought he lifted up the spear that was in his hand to kill me. No one that shall ever read this account will expect that I should be able to describe the horrors of my soul at this terrible vision, nor is it any more possible to describe the impression that remained upon my mind when I awaked and found it was but a dream. June 28th. Having been somewhat refreshed with the sleep I had, and the fit being entirely off, I got up, and though the fright and terror of my dream was very great, yet I considered that the fit of the ague would return again the next day, and now was my time to get something to refresh and support myself when I should be ill. And the first thing I did, I filled a large square case bottle with water and set it upon my table in reach of my bed. And to take off the chill or aguish, not sure how to pronounce it, aguish disposition of the water, I put about 1/4 of a pint of rum into it and mixed them together. And then I got me a piece of the goat's flesh and broiled it on the coals, but I could eat very little. I walked about, but was very weak, and withal very sad and heavy-hearted in the sense of my miserable condition, dreading the return of my distemper the next day. That means being sick. At night, I made my supper of 3 of the turtle's eggs, which I roasted in the ashes and eat, as we call it, in the shell. After I had eaten, I tried to walk, but found myself so weak that I could hardly carry the gun, for I never went out without that. So I went but a little way and sat down upon the ground, looking out upon the sea, which was just before me, and very calm and smooth. As I sat here, some such thoughts as these occurred to me. Why has God done this to me? What have I done to be thus used? My conscience presently checked me in that inquiry, as if I had blasphemed, and methought it spoke to me like a voice. Wretch! Dost thou ask what thou hast done? Look back upon a dreadful misspent life, and ask thyself what thou hast not done. Ask, why is it that thou wert not long ago destroyed? Why wert thou not drowned in Yarmouth, killed in the fight when the ship was taken by the Sally man-of-war, devoured by the wild beasts on the coast of Africa, or drowned here, when all the crew perished but thyself? Dost thou ask, what have I done? I was struck dumb with these reflections, as one astonished, and had not a word to say, no, not to answer to myself, but rose up, pensive and sad, walked back to my retreat, and went up over my wall, as if I had been going to bed, but my thoughts were sadly disturbed, and I had no inclination to sleep. So I sat down in my chair and lighted my lamp, for it began to be dark. Now, as the apprehension of the return of my distemper terrified me very much, it occurred to my thought that the Brazilians take no medicine but their tobacco for almost all distempers. That means for almost all illnesses. And I had a piece of a roll of tobacco in one of the chests, which was quite cured, and some also that was green and not quite cured. That means dried and ready to be used. I went, directed by heaven, no doubt, for in this chest I found a cure, both for the soul and body. I opened the chest and found what I had looked for, the tobacco. And as the few books I had saved lay there too, I took out one of the Bibles, which I had mentioned before, in which to this time I had not found leisure or so much as inclination to look into. I say I took it out and brought both that and the tobacco with me to the table. What use to make of the tobacco I knew not, as to my distemper, or whether it was good for it or no. But I tried several experiments with it, as if I was resolved it should hit one way or other. I first took a piece of a leaf and chewed it in my mouth, which indeed at first almost stupefied my brain, the tobacco being green and strong, and that I had not been much used to. Then I took some and steeped it an hour or two in some rum, and resolved to take a dose of it when I lay down. And lastly, I burnt some upon a pan of coals, and held my nose close over the smoke of it, as long as I could bear it, as well for the heat as almost for suffocation. Okay, so tobacco initially, it comes from the New World. It was first discovered by Europeans when they discovered the Americas. And so it is just becoming, in some ways, part of culture and society to make use of tobacco. And I guess Robinson doesn't really know what to do with it at this stage. Okay. But he knows enough to know that it has been used. He's seen people use it, but he's not really sure how. I think at one point we'd seen him chewing some earlier, but yeah. In the interval of this operation, I took up the Bible and began to read, but my head was too much disturbed with the tobacco to bear reading, at least that time. Only having opened the book casually, the first words that occurred to me were these: "Call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver, and thou shalt glorify me." And this is from Psalm chapter 50, verse 15, I believe. And the version that I have here, the Good News version, says, "Call to me when trouble comes. I will save you, and you will praise me." The Good News translation is a good translation to read alongside another version. So the ESV, the English Standard Version, is a good version to read, but sometimes if you find the language a little complex, it can be good to read the Good News translation as well, because it's got quite simplified English and also some pictures. However, I wouldn't call it the most authoritative version. And some of its translation decisions are a little bit odd. For example, it translates blessed as happy sometimes, which really does not have the same meaning. Okay, page 72. Call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver, and thou shalt glorify me. So he's taken the Bible, he's opened it up, and he's like, first verse that I read. It grew now late, and the tobacco had, as I said, dozed my head so much that I inclined to sleep. So I left my lamp burning in the cave, lest I should want anything in the night, and went to bed. But before I lay down, I did what I never had done in all my life. I kneeled down and prayed to God to fulfill the promise to me that if I called upon him in the day of trouble, he would deliver me. After my broken and imperfect prayer was over, I drank the rum in which I had steeped the tobacco, which was so strong and rank from the tobacco that I could scarce get it down. Immediately upon this, I went to bed. I found presently it flew up in my head violently, but I fell into a sound sleep and waked no more till by the sun it must necessarily be near 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. So basically, the combination of the rum and the tobacco flew up in his head, kind of makes his head go a little bit crazy, and then it knocks him out. Nay, to this hour, I am partly of the opinion that I slept all the next day and night till almost three that day after, for otherwise I knew not how I should lose a day out of my reckoning in the days of the week, as it appeared some years later I had done. So later on, when he's looking back over his calendar, it seems like there's a day missing, so he thinks he slept more than 24 hours, possibly. When I awaked, I found myself exceedingly refreshed, and my spirits lively and cheerful. When I got up, I was stronger than I was the day before, and my stomach better, for I was hungry. And in short, I had no fit the next day, but continued much altered for the better. This was the 29th. By fit, I believe he means just like being overcome by the fever, a fit of illness. The 30th was my well day, of course, and I went abroad with my gun, but did not care to travel too far. I killed a sea fowl or two and brought them home, but was not very forward to eat them. So I ate some more of the turtle's eggs, which were very good. This evening I renewed the medicine which I had supposed did me good the day before, the tobacco steeped in rum. Only I did not take so much as before, nor did I chew any of the leaf, or hold my head over the smoke. However, I was not so well the next day, which was the 1st of July, as I hoped I should have been, for I had a touch of the cold fit, but it was not much. July 2nd. I renewed the medicine all the 3 ways, and dosed myself with it as at first, and doubled the quantity which I drank. 3 means the 3rd. I missed the fit for good and all, though I did not recover my full strength for some weeks after. While I was thus gathering strength, my thoughts ran exceedingly upon the scripture, I will deliver thee. And the impossibility of my deliverance lay much upon my mind. July 4th. In the morning I took the Bible, and beginning in the New Testament, I began seriously to read it, and imposed upon myself to read a while every morning and every night, not tying myself to the number of chapters, but as long as my thoughts should engage me. It was not long after I set seriously to this work, but I found my heart more deeply and sincerely affected with the wickedness of my past life. The impression of my dream revived, and the words, all these things have not brought thee to repentance, ran seriously in my thought. Remember, that was from his dream. Now I began to construe the words mentioned above, call on me and I will deliver you, in a different sense from what I had ever done before. For then I had no notion of anything being called deliverance, but my being delivered from the captivity I was in. For though I was indeed at large in the place, yet the island was certainly a prison to me, and that in the worst sense in the world. But now I learned to take it in another sense. Now I looked back upon my past life with such horror, and my sins appeared so dreadful, that my soul sought nothing but God, but deliverance from the load of guilt that bore down all my comfort. As for my solitary life, it was nothing. I did not so much as pray to be delivered from it or think of it. It was all of no consideration in comparison to this. So he is being awakened to the realization of his sin and the state of his life. He's being filled with guilt and feeling a strong sense of repentance. My condition began now to be, though not less miserable as to my way of living, yet much easier to my mind, and my thoughts being directed by a constant reading of the Scripture, by a constant reading the Scripture and praying to God to things of a higher nature, and I had a great deal of comfort within, which till now I knew nothing of. Also, as my health and strength returned, I bestirred myself to furnish myself with everything that I wanted and make my way of living as regular as I could. From the 4th of July to the 14th, I was chiefly employed in walking about with my gun in my hand, a little and a little at a time, as a man that was gathering up his strength after a fit of sickness, for it is hardly to be imagined how low I was, and to what weakness I was reduced. The application which I made use of was perfectly new, and perhaps what had never cured an ague before. Neither can I recommend it to anyone, though it did carry off the fit, yet it rather contributed to weakening me, for I had frequently convulsions in my nerves and limbs for some time. So basically he's saying that all his use of tobacco, though he believes it probably helped with curing him, it's also made him feel weak and kind of terrible in other ways. I learned from it also this in particular, that being abroad in the rainy season was the most pernicious thing to my health that could be, especially in those rains which came attended with storms and hurricanes of wind. For as the rain came in the dry season, was almost most accompanied with such storms, so I found that rain was much more dangerous than the rain. Okay, I'm going to have to read that again. For as the rain which came in the dry season was always most accompanied with such storms, so I found that rain was much more dangerous than the rain which fell in September and October. So September and October is the rainy season, the monsoon, but it's not particularly stormy, I guess. But the storms are more dangerous when rain comes earlier, before the official rainy season. I had been now in this unhappy island above 10 months. All possibility of deliverance from this condition seemed to be entirely taken from me, and I firmly believed that no human shape had ever set foot upon that place. Having now secured my habitation, as I thought fully to my mind, I had a great desire to make a more perfect discovery of the island, and to see what other productions I might find, which I yet knew nothing of. It was the 15th of July that I began to take a more particular survey of the island itself. I went up the creek first, where I had brought my rafts on shore. I found, after I came about 2 miles up, that the tide did not flow any higher, and that it was no more than a little brook of running water, and very fresh and good. But this being the dry season, there was hardly any water in some parts of it, at least not enough to run in any stream, so as it could be perceived. On the bank of this brook I found many pleasant meadows, plain, smooth, and covered with grass, and on the rising parts of them next to the higher grounds, where the water, as it might be supposed, never overflowed, I found a great deal of tobacco, green, and growing to a great and very strong stalk. There were divers other plants, which I had no notion of, or understanding about, and might perhaps have virtues of their own, which I could not find out. The next day, the 16th, I went up the same way again, and after going somewhat farther than I had gone the day before, I found the brook, and the meadows began to cease, and the country became more woody than before. In this part I found different fruits, and particularly I found melons upon the ground in great abundance, and grapes upon the trees, and the vines had spread indeed over the trees, and the clusters of grapes were just now in their prime, very ripe and rich. This was a surprising discovery, and I was exceeding glad of them. But I was warned of my experience to eat sparingly of them, remembering that when I was ashore in Barbary, the eating of grapes killed several of our Englishmen who were slaves there by throwing them into fluxes and fevers. So I'm not entirely sure if this is actually grapes or berries. For one thing, grapes grow on vines, not trees. and don't know of any grapes that are poisonous, but berries sometimes are. But I found an excellent use for these grapes, and that was to cure or dry them in the sun and keep them as dried grapes or raisins are kept, which I thought would be, as indeed they were, as wholesome as agreeable to eat, when no grapes might be had. I spent all that evening there, and went not back to my habitation, which, by the way, was the first night, I might say, I had lain from home. In the night I took my first contrivance, and got up into a tree where I slept well, and the next morning proceeded upon my discovery, travelling nearly 4 miles, as I might judge by the length of the valley, keeping still due north, with a ridge of hills on the south and north side of me. At the end of this march I came to an opening where the country seemed to descend to the west, and a little spring of fresh water, which issued out of the side of the hill by me, ran the other way, that is, due east, and the country appeared so fresh, so green, so flourishing, everything being in a constant verdure or flourish of spring, that it looked like a planted garden. I descended a little on the side of that delicious vale, surveying it with a secret kind of pleasure, though mixed with my other afflicting thoughts, to think that this was all my own, that I was king and lord of all this country, that I was king and lord of all this country indefeasibly, and had a right of possession, and if I could convey it, I might have it in inheritance as completely as any lord of a manor in England. I saw here abundance of cocoa trees, orange and lemon and citron trees, but all wild and very few bearing any fruit, at least not then. However, the green limes that I gathered were not only pleasant to eat, but very wholesome, and I mixed their juice afterwards with water, which made it very wholesome and very cool and refreshing. I found now I had business enough to gather and carry home, and I resolved to lay up a store as well of grapes as limes and lemons, and to furnish myself for the wet season, which I knew was approaching. I therefore gathered a great heap of grapes in one place, and a lesser heap in another place, and a great parcel of limes and lemons in another place, and taking a few of each with me, I travelled homeward, and resolved to come again and bring a bag or sack or what I could make to carry the rest home. Accordingly, having spent 3 days in this journey, I came home. So I must now call my tent at home. So basically, he calls his tent and cave home. I'll just read that again. Accordingly, having spent 3 days in this journey, I came home. So I must now call my tent and my cave. But before I got thither, the grapes were spoiled, the richness of the fruits and the weight of the juice having broken them and bruised them. They were good for little or nothing. As to the limes, they were good, but I could bring but a few. The next day, being the 19th, I went back, having made me 2 small bags to bring home my harvest. But I was surprised when coming to my heap of grapes, which were so rich and fine when I gathered them. I found them all spread about, trod to pieces, and dragged about, some here and some there, and many eaten and devoured. By this I concluded there were some wild creatures thereabouts which had done this, but what they were I knew not. However, as I found that there was no laying them up in heaps, and no carrying them away in a sack, but that one way they would be destroyed, and the other way they would be crushed with their own weight, I took another course, for I gathered a large quantity of the grapes, and hung them up upon the out branches of the trees, that they might cure and dry in the sun. And as for the limes and lemons, I carried as many back as I could well stand under. When I came home from this journey, I contemplated with great pleasure the fruitfulness of that valley, and the pleasantness of the situation, the security from storms on that side of the water and the wood, and concluded that I had pitched upon a place to fix my abode, which was by far the worst part of the country. So he's realizing now that where he has decided to stay is actually not the best place, because it's far away from all of the amazing fruit and the beauty of some of the other parts of the island. And concluded that I had pitched upon a place to fix my abode, which was by far the worst part of the country. Upon the whole, I began to consider removing my habitation, and to look out for a place equally safe as where I now was, situated, if possible, in that pleasant, fruitful part of the island. This thought ran long in my head, and I was exceeding fond of it for some time. Then the pleasantness of the place tempting me. But when I came to a nearer view of it, and to consider that I was now by the seaside, where it was at least possible that something might happen to my advantage, and by the same ill fate that brought me thither might bring some other unhappy wretches to the same place, and though it was scarce probable that any such thing should ever happen, yet to enclose myself among the hills and woods in the center of the island was to anticipate my bondage, and to render such an affair not only improbable but impossible, and that therefore I ought not by any means to remove. So initially he's like, oh man, the valley surrounded by all the fruit and plantations is the best part of the island. I should move there. And then he realizes, wait, but I'm by the sea, and if someone else is washed on shore, then I will see them, or maybe even he'll be rescued. And if he leaves the seashore, if he goes inland, then he is essentially imprisoning himself permanently. However, I was so enamored of this place that I spent much of my time there for the whole remaining part of the month of July. Though upon second thoughts I resolved as above not to remove, yet I built me a little kind of a bower, and surrounded it at a distance with a strong fence, being a double hedge as high as I could reach, well staked, and filled between with brushwood, and here I lay very secure, sometimes 2 or 3 nights together, always going over it with a ladder. So essentially he's kind of built himself a holiday home. Always going over it with a ladder as before, so that I fancied now I had my country house and my seacoast house, and this work took me up to the beginning of August. I had but newly finished my fence and begun to enjoy my labor, but the rains came on and made me stick close to my first habitation, for though I had made me a tent like the other, with a piece of a sail and spread it very well, yet I had not the shelter of a hill to keep me from storms, nor a cave behind me to retreat into when the rains were extraordinary. About the beginning of August, as I said, I had finished my bower and began to enjoy myself. The 3rd of August I found the grapes I had hung up were perfectly dried, and indeed were excellent good raisins, so I began to take them down from the trees, and it was very happy that I did so, for the rains which followed would have spoiled them, and I had lost the best part of my winter food, for I had above 200 large bunches of them. No sooner had I taken them all down and carried most of them home to my cave, but it began to rain, and from hence, which was the 14th of August, it rained more or less every day till the middle of October, and sometimes so violently that I could not stir out of my cave for several days. In this confinement I began to be straitened for food, but venturing out twice, I one day killed a goat, and the last day, which was the 26th, found a very large tortoise, which was a treat to me. My food was regulated thus. I ate a bunch of raisins for my breakfast, a piece of the goat's flesh or the turtle for my dinner, broiled, for to my great misfortune I had no vessel to boil or stew anything, and 2 or 3 of the turtle's eggs for my supper. So he's calling dinner for Robinson, dinner is his largest meal of the day, which happens to be at lunchtime, and his evening meal is called supper because it is lighter. In different parts of the world, these terms have different meanings. I, for example, grew up calling the evening meal supper, and usually lunch was lunch, and dinner was usually lunch that we had on Sunday, and it was a bigger meal, and it was our Sunday dinner. And that was the only time we really used the word dinner. During this confinement in my cover by the rain, I worked daily 2 or 3 hours at enlarging my cave, and by degrees worked it on towards one side, till I came to the outside of the hill and made a door or way out, which came beyond my fence or wall, and so I came in and out this way. But I was not perfectly easy at lying so open, for as I had managed myself before, I was in a perfect enclosure, whereas now I thought I lay exposed and open for anything to come in upon me, and yet I could not perceive that there was any living thing to fear, the biggest creature that I had yet seen upon the island being a goat. September the 30th. I was now come to the unhappy anniversary of my landing. I cast up the notches on my post and found I had been on shore 365 days. I kept this day as a solemn fast, setting it apart to religious exercise. And that is the end of chapter 5. We will start chapter 6 next, which is not quite as long, but still fairly long. Robinson Crusoe has been on the island by himself, completely alone, for 1 whole year.